Chapter 7 of the Stillwater Tragedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Stillwater Tragedy by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Chapter 7. Richard made an early start that morning in search of employment, and duplicated the failure of the previous day. Nobody wanted him. If nobody wanted him in the village where he was born and bred, a village of counting rooms and workshops, was any other place likely to need him? He had only one hope, if it could be called a hope. At any rate, he had treated it tenderly as such, and kept it for the last. He would apply to Roland Slocum. Long ago, when Richard was an urchin making pot-hooks in the lane, the man used occasionally to pat him on the head and give him pennies. This was not a foundation on which to rear a very lofty castle, but this was all he had. It was noon when Richard approached the marble yard, and the men were pouring out into the street through the wide gate in the rough deal fence which inclosed the works. Heavy, brawny men, covered with fine white dust, who shouldered each other like cattle, and took the sidewalk to themselves. Richard stepped aside to let them pass, eyeing them curiously as possible comrades. Suddenly a slim, dark fellow, who had retained his paper cap and leather apron, halted, and thrust forth a horny hand. The others went on.
"Hullo, Dick Shackford."
"What, is that you, Will? You here?"
"Been here 2 years now, one of Slocum's apprentices,"
added Durgin, with an air of easy grandeur. 2 years! How time flies, when it doesn't crawl. Do you like it?"
"My time will be out next—" "Oh, the work? Well, yeah, it's not bad, and there's a jolly set in the yard. But how about you? I heard last night you'd got home. Been everywhere and come back wealthy? The boys used to say you was off piratin'."
"No such luck," answered Richard with a smile. "I didn't prey on the high seas. Quite the contrary. The high sea captured my kit and 4-year savings. I will tell you about it some day. If I have a limb to my name and a breath left to my body, it is no thanks to the Indian Ocean. That is all I have got, Will, and I am looking around for bread and butter, literally bread and butter."
"No, and the old gentleman so rich?"
Durgin said this with sincere indignation, and was perhaps unconscious himself of experiencing that nameless, shadowy satisfaction which Rochefoucauld says we find in the adversity of our best friends. Certainly Richard looked very seedy in his suit of slop-shop clothes. "I was on my way to Mr. Slocum's to see if I could do anything with him," Richard continued.
"To get a job, do you mean?"
"Yes, to get work. To learn how to work. To master a trade, in short."
"You can't be an apprentice, you know," said Durgin.
"Why not?"
"Slocum has to."
"Suppose he should happen to want another. He might."
"The association won't allow it."
"What association?"
"The Marble Workers' Association, of course."
"They wouldn't allow it. How is that?"
"This is the way of it. Slocum is free to take on 2 apprentices every year, but no more. That prevents workmen increasing too fast, and so keeps up wages. The Marble Workers' Association is a very neat thing, I can tell you."
"But doesn't Mr. Slocum own the yard? I thought he did."
"Yeah, he owns the yard."
"If he wished to extend the business, couldn't he employ more hands?"
"As many as he could get, skilled workmen, but not apprentices."
"And Mr. Slocum agrees to that?" inquired Richard.
"He does."
"And likes it?"
"Not he. He hates it, but he can't help himself."
"Upon my soul, I don't see what prevents him taking on as many apprentices as he wants to."
"Why, the association, to be sure," returned
Durgin, glancing at the town clock, which marked 7 minutes past the hour. "But how could they stop him?"
"In plenty of ways. Suppose Slocum has a lot of unfinished contracts on hand. He always has fat contracts, and the men was to knock off work. That would be kind of awkward, wouldn't it?"
"For a day or 2, yes. He could send out of town for hands," suggested Richard.
"And they wouldn't come. If the association said stay where you are. They are mostly in the ring. Some outsiders might come, though."
"Then what?"
"Why, then the boys would make it pretty hot for them in Stillwater. Don't you notice?"
"I notice there's not much chance for me," said Richard despondingly. "Isn't that so?"
"Can't say. Better talk with Slocum. But I must get along. I have to be back sharp at 1. I want to hear about your knocking around, the worst kind. Can we meet somewhere tonight? At the tavern?"
"The tavern? That didn't used to be a quiet place."
"It isn't quiet now, but there's nowhere else to go of a night. It's a comfortable den, and there's always some capital fellows dropping in. A glass of lager with a mate is not a bad thing after a hard day's work."
"Both are good things when they are of the right sort."
"That's like saying I'm not the right sort, isn't it?"
"I meant nothing of the kind. But I don't take to the tavern. Not that I'm squeamish. I have lived 4 years among sailors, and have been in rougher places than you ever dreamed of. But all the same, I'm afraid of the tavern. I've seen many a brave fellow wrecked on that reef." "You always was a bit stuck up," said Durgin candidly. "Not an inch. I never had much reason to be, and less now than ever, when I can scarcely afford to drink water, let alone beer. I will drop round to your mother's some evening. I hope she's well, and tell you of my ups and downs. That will be pleasanter for all hands."
"Oh, as you like."
"Now for Mr. Slocum, though you have taken the wind out of me." The two separated, Durgin with a half-smile on his lip, and Richard in a melancholy frame of mind. He passed from the grass-fringed street into the deserted marble yard, where it seemed as if the green summer had suddenly turned into white winter, and threading his way between the large drifts of snowy stone, knocked at the door of Mr. Slocum's private office. William Durgin had summed up the case fairly enough, as it stood between the Marble Workers' Association and Roland Slocum. The system of this branch of the trades union kept trained workmen comparatively scarce, and enabled them to command regular and even advanced prices at periods when other trades were depressed. The older hands looked upon a fresh apprentice in the yard with much the same favor as working men of the era of Jacquard looked upon the introduction of a new piece of machinery. Unless the apprentice had exceptional tact, he underwent a rough novitiate. In any case, he served a term of social ostracism before he was admitted to full comradeship. Mr. Slocum could easily have found openings each year for a dozen learners, had the matter been under his control, but it was not.
"I am the master of each man individually," he declared, "but collectively they are my master."
So his business, instead of naturally spreading and becoming a benefit to the many, was kept carefully pruned down to the benefit of the few. He was often forced to decline important contracts, the filling of which would have resulted to the advantage of every person in the village. Mr. Slocum recognized Richard at once, and listened kindly to his story. It was Mr. Slocum's way to listen kindly to everyone, but he was impressed with Richard's intelligence and manner, and became desirous, for several reasons, to assist him. In the first place, there was room in the shops for another apprentice. Experienced hands were on jobs that could have been as well done by beginners, and in the second place, Mr. Slocum had an intuition that Lemuel Shackford was not treating the lad fairly, though Richard had said nothing to this effect. Now Mr. Slocum and Mr. Shackford were just then at swords' points.
"I don't suppose I could annoy Shackford more," was Mr. Slocum's reflection, "than by doing something for this boy, whom he has always shamelessly neglected."
The motive was not a high one, but Richard would have been well satisfied with it if he could have divined it. He did divine that Mr. Slocum was favorably inclined towards him, and stood watching that gentleman's face with hopeful anxiety.
"I have my regulation number of young men, Richard," said Mr. Slocum, "and there will be no vacancy until autumn. If you could wait a few months."
Richard's head drooped.
"Can't do that? You write a good hand, you say? Perhaps you could assist the bookkeeper until there's a chance for you in the yard."
"I think I could, sir," said Richard eagerly.
"If you are only a draftsman, now I could do something much better for you. I intend to set up a shop for ornamental carving, and I want someone to draw patterns. If you had a knack at designing, if you could draw at all."
Richard's face lighted up.
"Perhaps you have a turn that way? I remember the queer things you used to scratch in the mud in the court when you were a little shaver. Can you draw?"
"Why, that's the one thing I can do," cried Richard. "In a rough fashion, of course," he added, fearing he had overstated it.
"It is a rough fashion that will serve. You must let me see some of your sketches."
"I haven't any, sir. I had 100 in my sea chest, but that was lost. Pencilings of old archways, cathedral spires, bits of frieze, and such odds and ends as took my fancy in the ports we touched at. I recollect one bit. I think I could do it for you now. Shall I?" Mr. Slocum nodded assent, smiling at the young fellow's enthusiasm, and only partially suspecting his necessity. Richard picked up a pen and began scratching on a letter sheet which lay on the desk. He was 5 or 6 minutes at the work, during which the elder man watched him with an amused expression. "It's a section of cornice on the façade of the Hindu College at Calcutta," said Richard, handing him the paper. "No, it's the Custom House. I forget which, but it doesn't matter." The amused look gradually passed out of Mr. Slocum's countenance as he examined the sketch. It was roughly but clearly drawn, and full of facility.
"Why, that's very clever,"
he said, holding it at arm's length, and then with great gravity.
"I hope you're not a genius, Richard. That would be too much of a fine thing. If you are not, you can be of service to me in my plans."
Richard laughingly made haste to declare that to the best of his knowledge and belief he was not a genius. and it was decided on the spot that Richard should assist Mr. Sims, the bookkeeper, and presently try his hand at designing ornamental patterns for the carvers, Mr. Slocum allowing him apprentice wages until the quality of his work should be ascertained. "It is very little," said Mr. Slocum, "but it will pay your board if you do not live at home." "I shall not remain at my cousin's," Richard replied, "if you call that home." "I can imagine it's not much of a home. Your cousin, not to put too fine a point on it, is a wretch." "I am sorry to hear you say that, sir. He is my only living kinsman." "You are fortunate in having but one, then. However, I am wrong to abuse him to you, but I cannot speak of him with moderation. He has just played me a despicable trick. Look here." Mr. Slocum led Richard to the door, and pointing to a row of new workshops, which extended the entire length of one side of the marble yard, said, "I built these last spring. After the shingles were on, we discovered that the rear partition, for a distance of 75 feet, overlapped 2 inches on Shackford's meadow. I was ready to drop when I saw it. Your cousin is such an unmanageable old fiend. Of course I went to him immediately, and what do you think? He demanded $500 for that strip of land. $500 for a few inches of swamp meadow, not worth $10 the acre. Then take your disreputable old mill off my property, says Shackford. He called it a disreputable old mill. I was hasty, perhaps, and I told him to go to the devil. He said he would, and he did, for he went to Blandman. When the lawyers got hold of it, they bothered the life out of me, so I just moved the building forward 2 inches, at an expense of $700. Then what does the demon do but board up my windows opening on the meadow? Richard, I make it a condition that you shall not lodge at Shackford's." "Nothing could induce me to live another day in the same house with him, sir," answered Richard, suppressing an inclination to smile, and then seriously, "His bread is bitter." Richard went back with a light heart to Welch's Court. At the gate of the marble yard he met William Durgin returning to work. The steam whistle had sounded the call, and there was no time for exchange of words, so Richard gave his comrade a bright nod and passed by. Durgin turned and stared after him. "Looks as if Slocum has taken him on, but it never can be as an apprentice. He wouldn't dare do it." Mr. Shackford had nearly finished his frugal dinner when Richard entered. "If you can't hit it to being at your meals," said Mr. Shackford, helping himself absently to the remaining chop, "perhaps you had better stay away altogether." "I can do that now, cousin," replied Richard sunnily. "I have engaged with Slocum." The old man laid down his knife and fork. "With Slocum? A Shackford? A miserable marble chipper?" There was so little hint of the aristocrat in Lemuel Shackford's sordid life and person that no one suspected him of even self-esteem. He went as meanly dressed as a tramp, and as careless of contemporary criticism. Yet clear down in his liver, or somewhere in his anatomy, he nourished an odd abstract pride in the family Shackford. Heaven knows why. To be sure, it dated far back. Its women had always been virtuous, and its men, if not always virtuous, had always been ship captains. But beyond this the family had never amounted to anything, and now there was so very little left of it. For Richard as Richard, Lemuel cared nothing. For Richard as a Shackford, he had a chaotic feeling that defied analysis, and had never before risen to the surface. It was therefore with a disgust entirely apart from the hatred of Slocum or regard for Richard that the old man exclaimed, "A Shackford, a miserable marble chipper?" "That is better than hanging around the village with my hands in my pockets, isn't it?" "I don't know that anybody has demanded that you should hang around the village." "I ought to go away, you mean? But I have found work here, and I might not find it elsewhere." "Stillwater is not the place to begin life in. It's the place to go away from and come back to." "Well, I have come back." "And how? With one shirt and a lot of bad sailor habits." "My one shirt is my only very bad habit," said Richard with a laugh. He could laugh now. "And I mean to get rid of that." Mr. Shackford snapped his fingers disdainfully. "You ought to have stuck to the sea. That's respectable. In 10 years you might have risen to the master of a bark. That would have been honorable. You might have gone down in a gale. You probably would, and that would have been fortunate. But a stone cutter? You can understand," growled Mr. Shackford, reaching out for his straw hat, which he put on and crushed over his brows. "I don't keep a boarding house for Slocum's hands." "Oh, I'm far from asking it," cried Richard. "I am thankful for the 2 nights' shelter I have had." "That's some of your sarcasm, I suppose," said Mr. Shackford, half turning, with his hands on the doorknob. "No, it is some of my sincerity. I am really obliged to you. You weren't very cordial, to be sure, but I did not deserve cordiality."
"You figured that out correctly."
"I want to begin over again, you see, and start fair."
"Then begin by dropping Slocum."
"You have not given me a chance to tell you what the arrangement is. However, it's irrevocable."
"I don't want to hear. I don't care a curse, so long as it is an arrangement."
And Shackford hurried out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Then Richard, quite undisturbed by his cousin's unreasonableness, sat himself down to eat the last meal he was ever to eat under that roof, a feat that his cousin's appetite had rendered comparatively easy. While engaged in this, Richard resolved in his mind several questions as to his future abode. He could not reconcile his thought to any of the working men's boarding houses, of which there were 5 or 6 in the slums of the village, where the doorways were greasy, and women flitted about in the hottest weather with thick woolen shawls over their heads. Yet his finances did not permit him to aspire to lodgings much more decent. If he could only secure a small room somewhere in a quiet neighborhood, possibly Mrs. Durgin would let him have a chamber in her cottage. He was beginning life over again, and it struck him as nearly an ideal plan to begin it on the identical spot where he had, in a manner, made his first start. Besides, there was William Durgin for company, when the long nights of the New England winter set in. The idea smiled so pleasantly in Richard's fancy that he pushed the plate away from him impatiently, and picked up his hat, which lay on the floor beside the chair. That evening he moved from the Shackford house to Mrs. Durgin's cottage in Cross Street. It was not an imposing ceremony. With a small brown paper parcel under his arm, he walked from one threshold to the other, and the thing was done. End of chapter 7.